Good morning, everybody, and welcome to New South Wales Farmers Solar PV plus Batteries Financial Analysis Calculator webinar. This is a new recording, not the live presentation. My name is Jerry Flores. I'm a photovoltaic engineer, and I'm also the Energy Innovation Manager of New South Wales Farmers. I've previously managed programs promoting energy efficiency and renewable energy across agriculture in New South Wales, and my role currently involves helping farmers, small businesses and residences across the state to improve the challenges that come with high costs of energy, including electricity and fuel. Today we're going to talk a bit about batteries, as well as some of the financial cases for them, and the New South Wales Farmers Calculator that allows us to analyze such cases. All right, well, let's dive in and have a look around at what's changed. And principally, it's been the launch of a few battery products in the last year or two that's changed the game a bit in Australia. In 2014, I believe, the RedFlow zinc bromide flow battery, the ZBM, was made available, and it is expected for them to relaunch this battery in 2016 under a new package in order to compete with other offers, including, for instance, the new AGL Power Legato battery, which we see here, which was released in May 2015. That's the 7.5 kilowatt hour battery, but AGL has also released a suite of battery products, not just this one, but other ones, Sunverge systems, I believe they're called, which have a higher capacity, 11 kilowatt hours and 19 kilowatt hours. And of course, the one that's been talked about the most and announced since last year, I think also around May, is the Tesla Energy's PowerWall and PowerPack systems. Now, these were announced. Elon Musk himself said that the Australian market was going to be one of the first to be served, given the particular conditions of electricity pricing that we have here. And they were launched by a variety of providers, including Origin Energy, NaturalSolar, Energy Matters, and a few others in December 2015. So it's assume that these will be available not just for sale, but for installation in January 2016. So we should soon see the rollout of these new technologies. And with that, we get to see a bit more on the pricing points that these technologies permit us. So the pricing point for battery storage has been around above the 2000s, but with these new products, we are now seeing somewhere in the range of $1,100 to $1,900 per useful kilowatt hour of installed capacity. And if you amortize this cost, which means taking into account the cost of any grid power which you might draw from, or the battery investment as well, if you take all the investments together, compared against the price of the power that you obtain from that, we've seen prices of around 20 cents per kilowatt hour supplied over the lifetime of the system. And that's better than peak power prices in certain scenarios, so it might be potentially viable financially for some already. We still see various types of technologies and perhaps finally a winner emerging, but not quite sure. So we have lithium phosphate, lithium ion, flow batteries, including RedFlow zinc bromide, but lead acid still dominates. With the big investments that's being pushed via Tesla Energy's gigafactory production, we expect to see more development in the lithium-ion space, and with economies of scale, a reduction in prices, and perhaps a winner emerge, potentially lithium, but at this point, we're not really prepared to say. It might still go either way. It might be a different technology, might even be a different supplier. Nonetheless, the other price points which show encouraging trends as well is PV systems. So the latest residential average price per watt across capital cities in Australia was $1.6 per watt. So that's a brand new record. It's the lowest it's ever been. And for commercial systems, those are systems above 10 kilowatts. We've also reached a new record of around $1.28 per watt of installed system. So these trends are derived from Solar Choice. They are a quote aggregator, and you can follow the link on the slide there to access it. These prices reflect what you might pay, including GST and the rebates that a provider might offer you. So this is encouraging, meaning that not only are batteries coming into the market at new competitive prices, but we're also seeing that solar continues on a progressing downtrend of more affordable prices, which is good. And the other thing that's looming is the end of the solar bonus scheme. Now, the solar bonus scheme entails 20-cent or 60-cent gross feed-in tariffs for systems installed under the scheme back in 2010 and 2011. I'll talk a bit about the relevance of these systems a bit later, but basically, back in 2010, this scheme was put in place and we saw enormous take-up in New South Wales. In fact, even though the average system size nationally was only about 1.53 kilowatts in 2010, we saw large systems being installed in regional and rural areas, and through our estimations, we believe that there's around 52,000 systems of an average size of 2.5 kilowatts, so way above the average for that time, that are still under the solar bonus scheme. The fact that they are above the average installation size back then really points to the fact that they're likely oversized for the immediate electricity loads that those dwellings or residences or businesses have. So what I mean by that is that since the solar bonus scheme had a cap of 10 kilowatts and it rewarded every single kilowatt and every single kilowatt hour of energy produced by the system, there really was no need to match the system size with the business's electricity use or the household's electricity use. It was more about maximizing the system size you could get so that you could get as much payment from the energy produced for that system. And we'll get back to that and address why this is very relevant to new developments we're seeing in batteries later on. Okay, so what are some of the scenarios that are beginning to be used for batteries? I'm going to talk about a few of them today. One that, again, is getting a bit of attention, but perhaps isn't the most financially sane option, is obviously to disconnect. So if you already have grid power at your residence or your dwelling and batteries continue to become more affordable, well, some believe that we might be able to disconnect altogether, and I think it's still too pricey, and I'll go into a fair bit of detail as to why. The other scenario is if you don't have a grid connection at your property or dwelling and you're doing a new off-grid build. This, I think, is a very sensible and reasonable scenario. I think this is very sensible in areas that have the grid too far away from them and would incur large costs to connect to it. And the two main ones which our calculator pertains to, and that's using your solar resource or using a battery for load shifting to remove power that would otherwise be more expensive to you. And that's known as price arbitrage. So what we can do is we can store some of the solar power that would otherwise be exported and use it to meet power that we would usually draw from the grid at peak prices. So we'll go into that. And finally, there's peak shaving. And this is mostly to address demand charges, and therefore it pertains to the larger customers, those who have a contested contract with their retailer. So if you're using more than, I believe the threshold is 100 megawatt hours in New South Wales, although it might be 150, then you'll be bumped up to a contested contract and you will start to see demand charges. And batteries might be good to bring those down. All right, let's start with disconnecting and why I think it might be a bit pricey. What we have in front of us is a load profile, and this load profile is not measured. It's simulated data of a San Francisco home, one that uses a substantial amount of electricity, hence high residential, and has an average consumption of 27.3 kilowatt hours per day. Now, if we were to build a system to allow this household to go off grid, well, we may say look at the average and go, okay, well, there's 27.3 kilowatt hours. Maybe to meet those needs, we need a 9 kilowatt PV system and a whole bunch of batteries, 47 useful kilowatt hours worth of batteries to give us maybe 1.72 days of autonomy. And using the pricing that I showed previously, so the average pricing for useful kilowatt hours is around 1,500 now, and a PV system pricing of $1 a watt, which again is optimistic, not to mention other ancillaries, installation, etc., we're probably looking at something around $80,000, and that's already starting to say, well, that could be pricey. But we're not done. Of course, anyone would say, look, you can't just look at the average day and assume you're going to be fine with that. So we'd obviously have to look at this data set because we do have the whole year and say, well, what's the worst day of the year and what's the solar resource then? So for this data set, the worst day is 34.46 kilowatt hours. It's used during the winter time, which is unfortunate, obviously, because that's when we have the least solar resource available. So to meet the needs of the household on the worst day, we'd probably need a much bigger PV system, maybe 15 kilowatts, and a bit more batteries. And as we do this, the price of our off-grid system is starting to ramp up, and we're probably looking really at $100,000. So, but we're using simulated data. And what they do is they assume when energy is going to be used and by what type of appliances and load types based on surveys and statistics, and they generate a whole year worth of hourly consumption data. And that gives you a good average for households and businesses, but it doesn't give you the subtleties of actual electricity consumption, and I'll show you how. So this GIF, which I hope you can see in whichever format you're watching this, shows the yearly load in hours. So each of the points is every hour for both a simulated as well as a real measured profile. So the top simulated data is, as I mentioned, from the Department of Energy's simulated San Francisco data set for a household. And on average, that household uses 27.3 kilowatt hours per day. So if you average all those troughs over the whole year as it's scrolling by, you'd get 27.3 kilowatt hours per day. The bottom data is from an actual measured household. So this was part of the Smart Grid, Smart City program by the Federal Department of Innovation and Science in Australia. And they conducted a trial where they measured energy use over more than 3 years. And as part of that, we have this data set from one customer in Sydney. So that customer in Sydney, his energy consumption has been scaled so that on average over the whole year, he's also using an average of 27 kilowatt hours per day. So what you're seeing here is both the top and the bottom, their average energy use per day is 27 kilowatt hours. Yet look at the difference in peak loads and peaking and noise, how much it can change from day to day, hour to hour. And that's why using simulated data can be a bit dangerous when you're trying to size off-grid PV system. And this is illustrated quite well in these next set of charts. So again, on the left, that's the simulated data. That's the profile of consumption, the average profile of consumption during one day over the entire year. And on the right, it's the real data. Again, it's been scaled so that it's also 27 kilowatt hours, but you can see they share some of the same features. And you might think, well, why can't we use either? Why, if the profile of both is very similar, we have that famous duck curve with a peak around 9 a.m. and then a larger evening peak around 8 and 10 p.m. Why can't we use either data set? I mean, they look fairly similar if you look at the average over the whole year, but let's actually graph both sets of data. What do they look like? And that's what they look like. And that is pretty impressive when I actually saw it. On the left, if we actually calculate all the area under that blue line, so if we integrate that plot and divide it by 365, we get 27.3 kilowatt hours. And on the right, same deal. If we take all the area underneath that plot and we divide it by 365, we also get an average of 27 kilowatt hours. So while both have a very similar daily profile and a very similar average energy consumption per day, they are very different profiles because one is a simulated load which doesn't take into account the subtleties and noise inherent in actual electricity consumption, while the other one is a real data set. And you can see some interesting features, obviously. Mid-March to mid-April, on the real Sydney load data set, we can see that the household occupants probably went on a holiday as the consumption reduced significantly, and what remains is probably refrigerator or other load that they don't usually turn off. So that's pretty interesting to see. So back to our standalone system, our off-grid, our disconnecting desires. Let's look at the worst case for the real data. And we'll find it's not 34 kilowatt hours like the simulated one had. It's 51 kilowatt hours. And the highest consumption happens on 2 days. Well, there's 2 days that are above 50 kilowatt hours. One is in the middle of winter on the 30th of July, because winter in Sydney is obviously during the June and July months. And the other one is closer to summer on the 18th of January. So potentially the 18th of January peak isn't as troublesome because you will have a bit more solar resource. But having the highest consumption, and in fact the highest consumption of 51 kilowatt hours happens on the 30th of July, and that's that plot shown there, in winter introduces more problems because now we have to size an even larger system if we're going to cater for that. Now anyone who's sensible wouldn't start whacking on even more PV and more batteries, so that might be part of the solution. But at this point you'd also probably put in a generator to cater for those edge cases of increased consumption. So now we're looking at probably 70 kilowatt hours of useful battery storage, maybe 25 kilowatts of solar, a diesel genset, not sure about the sizing of that, and what's our price tag? Well, it's even larger than we thought. So now it's looking at 130,000 Australian dollars just to disconnect, purely to eliminate what I doubt would be more than about 3 grand or maybe up to 4 grand a year on electricity prices. So that's sort of the comparison you're looking. And by the way, if you look at your consumption and you do get that peaky load like I showed in the previous graph, you wouldn't simply plop on a diesel generator. A better approach would also look at energy efficiency and try to remove some of those peaks and high consumption days through management instead of just adding more infrastructure. Because it's a lot better to simply build a small system that caters for your average day, and then whenever you have a non-average day, you still have the grid there to supply whatever you need. So that's why I think disconnecting is not only pricey, but I also think it's a bit of a waste. So as I mentioned, if you're really going to disconnect, you have to put in a lot more PV systems and batteries that you're going to be using every day, because you have to cater for those edge cases. And the genset, for instance, would only work maybe a couple of days or a couple of weeks of the year at most, and otherwise it would just be sitting there. So number one, the PV panels are not connected to the grid. So if your batteries are fully charged and you're meeting all your loads, yet you have more solar generated power, there's nowhere where that power can go. Whereas if that was still grid connected, then that would serve to meet other loads on the wider grid and potentially incentivize the ramp down of generation by dirtier generators like coal. So in that sense, it's not a good environmental decision. And there's a columnist by the name of Tristan Edis who made this point in a column on the late Climate Spectator, which I'd encourage you to look up. And not only that, but we also have a larger environmental footprint purely because of the increase in infrastructure that we have to put into the property. So more batteries, more PV panels, and a genset, all of that has embodied emissions, and not just in terms of carbon, but in their manufacturing. There's all sorts of environmental implications down the supply chain. So if you're thinking you're doing this because you're green, I'm not so sure. It might, however, be a way to send a message. And that's what's happening in the case of this sugarcane farm in Bundaberg, Queensland. Now, it's not purely for the reason of sending a message that he's going off-grid. In his case, and this is another point I want to make, there are some cases where going off-grid does make sense, or at least not for the entirety of say, all your residential loads, but in this case, for his irrigation loads. So it's a non-time critical load. He has the capacity to irrigate both during sunshine hours and then supply additional water at nighttime via a different irrigation system, which is flooded. And because of that, he now has a facility to say, well, he no longer will connect to Ergon Energy for one of his pumps providing pressure for his irrigation system, and instead he will put in a large PV system that will serve that job. Now, he will retain access and a connection to the grid for a period of time, and that's obviously just to ensure that he can deal through a few seasons using nothing but solar PV and the other irrigation infrastructure. And once he's certain of that, then obviously he will truly disconnect that account, which means he'll also save on any service charges. So there are cases where it will add up, but usually not for what we consider critical loads, such as your residential or business office loads. His setup, Kelvin's, does not have a battery system, and it doesn't require. After all, water storage is one of the best ways to store energy if you can lift it. So yes, there are cases for going off-grid, maybe not in the case of using batteries for a whole household, but maybe using PV and a direct load, such as for pumping for irrigation purposes. Now let's talk about new off-grid builds. And there's really very little to say. It's incredibly sensible. We went through how it could cost up to $130,000 or more to have a fully off-grid system, and that was for a house using a lot of power. 27 kilowatt hours per day is considered a high consumption. I believe the average for a household in Sydney of 3 to 4 people is somewhere in 20 kilowatt hours per day. So 27 is pretty high. You'd have a lot of amenities, and you wouldn't be compromising on much. And that has a price tag of, yes, hefty, but it may not compare to what might cost to bring poles, wires, and transformers over to a property that's far from a connection point. And that's why new off-grid builds make a lot of sense. And I have a few examples of them. So this is a house in the mid-north coast, and these are for sale. These are from real estate websites, actually. This one is in a town called Karora, and you can see it's a pretty large house, has a off-grid PV system. And here's another one, also in New South Wales, west of Bega in the south, in a town called Bimbuka, or Bimbuka, I'm not sure. What's important here is that none of these houses, if you look them up, and I can provide the links for this if you want, they didn't really compromise on the amenities that are available for the people staying there. So they have fridges, they have dishwashers, they have TVs, they have hot water. If you're far from the grid, the cost of providing a lot of power through PV might still be quite a bit less than putting in the poles and wires to just connect to the grid. So if you're pretty far, it's very sensible. It's really where we think we'll see a lot of growth is in these off-grid houses that didn't have a connection point to the grid to begin with. All right, so yeah, that's a no-brainer. Next, and this is what the New South Wales Farmers calculator is pertinent to, and that's using your your batteries to maximize your solar resource. And this is where I'm also going to go back to what happened with the solar bonus scheme. So if you are sizing a system, only solar PV today being January 22nd, 2016, you have to be very careful because you don't want to buy one that's too big. And why don't you want to buy one that's too big? Well, so these are 3 identical load profiles shown in blue, hypothetical. So they're hypothetical load profiles of a household, overlaid with what we might get in terms of generation from different sized PV systems. So 3 kilowatts, 5 kilowatts, 7.5 kilowatts. And the red indicates what's extra, what's surplus from the household's energy needs. So that's being exported. Now at the moment, most states have wound down their feed-in tariffs. So that means for that power that you export, you really have to negotiate or take the standing offer available from your retailer for what you're going to get paid for it. At the moment, that's about 6 cents per kilowatt hour. So for every kilowatt hour that your solar PV system generates, it could either save you anywhere from 20 to 30 cents per kilowatt hour if that energy is used to cover your own needs, or if it's in surplus, it might only net you a benefit of 6 cents. So as we keep making the system larger and larger, as we can see, a greater portion of the power that's generated is only netting you 6 cents of benefit. And that means that as you get a bigger and bigger system and you start exporting a bigger and bigger portion of your power, that your simple payback is going to just get longer and longer and longer. And that might not be a bad thing if your finances or your financial plan allows for a payback that's a bit further drawn out, because the savings do go up, albeit as you keep getting a bigger system, the savings keep getting marginally smaller and smaller because more of your energy is only netting 6 cents per kilowatt hour. All right, so what's the relation of this to the solar bonus scheme? Well, what happened with the solar bonus scheme is that any energy generated by your PV system, regardless of whether it's exported or used on site, since it was provided with a gross feed-in tariff, will net you 60 cents per kilowatt hour. Now this scheme is close to new entrants. It actually closed in 2011, but there's still about 52,000 systems in regional and rural Australia under this scheme. Now they had an incentive to install systems that were as large as possible, and that was capped at 10 kilowatts. So what's happened now is that reward that they get paid, that's going to disappear on the 1st of January 2017. So they have about a year left of the feed-in tariff from that scheme. And once that happens, they're going to be on the same deal that anyone trying to get a system is on today. And they're probably also going to have a very large system, one that's oversized for their local electricity needs, for the business or farming needs of the property. And because of that, they'll be looking for a way to maximize the utility of that system, and that means might be higher demand for battery systems next year. That might coincide with the further lowering of prices of battery systems, and thus really serve to promote the rollout of battery systems. So what do we do with this export power if either I have a big system from the solar bonus scheme or I accidentally ordered one recently and oversized it? Well, this is what batteries might come in for. So price arbitration, it's simple. The way it works is we say, well, look, we have a load like this with the famous duck curve, as it's called, with the two humps. We have a lull in energy use around noon, which is precisely when we're generating the most power. And we want to use all that surplus energy, instead of gifting it away to the retailer for 6 cents per kilowatt hour, let's put it away in a battery and then use it to meet our needs later when power might be even more expensive or just as expensive. And that's that second hump there. So it's simple, it's easy to understand. That's basically what we want to do. However, how do you calculate the savings from this? Because there's a few things in play. Obviously, you might derive a better benefit from storing power if you can use that stored power to reduce your consumption of the most expensive power. But who has electricity that changes in price? Well, that's people on time of use meters. So if your price changes depending on what time of the day it is, or whether it's a weekend or a day of the week, then you might be interested in seeing how you can remove your most expensive power so that most of the power you're using is either from the sun or off-peak or shoulder. So who is this best for? Obviously, as I mentioned, it's probably best for people who are in time of use, who will have access to cheaper power. But let's have a look at the rates of time of use in New South Wales. So there's 3 distributors. There's Ausgrid, Endeavour Energy, and Essential Energy. These 3 images that I show here, this is only for work days. And we're going to concentrate on work days, albeit the calculator does calculate weekends too, but it's work days where the big prices are, because weekends usually have off-peak and shoulder rates only. So Essential Energy has the longest peak window. And it's not really that the peak window is long, it's more so that the shoulder is costed at the same rate as the peak window. So the price you pay for shoulder is the same as the one you pay for peak, and hence in my calculator and in our workings, we consider both shoulder and peak in an Essential Energy schedule as the same thing because they cost the same thing. However, it's not such a high rate. They're paying $30 per kilowatt hour. That's an average derived from Origin Energy's offers. This is without discounts, by the way, and that's lower than the peak rate for customers in Endeavour Energy's network, and it's a lot lower than the price of power for Ausgrid during peak. And that's the one that really draws attention. Customers on the Ausgrid distribution areas are paying up to 51 cents per kilowatt hour during peak hours. And while that window is the smallest of the 3 distributors, it is the most expensive one by a fair margin. So in our calculations, we estimate, and we've seen with a few models, that people in the Ausgrid distribution area are likely to have the best case for new batteries for price arbitration because of that dynamic, that they have the most expensive power. Now this is still without discounts, so it's important to consider that as well. All right, so we know that Ausgrid customers are likely to be the key candidates for this technology. Where are they located? Well, we have a map of some of the distribution areas in New South Wales, and basically it's near the metro areas of Sydney, all the way to Port Stephens, and up to the northern regions, the northern beaches of the far northwest of Sydney towards the Upper Hunter area. That's not to say that batteries might not be of use to other people in regional and rural areas on the Essential Energy network, but we think the let's call it low-hanging fruit will be first people on the Ausgrid area. And then again, that might change because the schedule of tariffs and the pricing itself can change from year to year, and as network revenue determinations change with every reset every 5 years. So that's not set in stone. That could change maybe in a year. That could change maybe in 5 years more drastically. So we don't know. Nonetheless, let's start using the calculator so that we can learn how to use it. All right. So the calculator is available on the Ag Innovator's website, which I'm going to head to right now. And there it is. So that's the URL at the top, aginnovators.org.au/content/solar-pv-battery-financial-analysis-calculator. And it looks a bit like that. Now, I haven't refreshed this in a while, so if I try to change anything, it's probably not going to work. Yeah, and there you go. So if you leave the page open for a while and then try to use it, it'll give you this thing saying you want to continue interacting. You have to reload it. So you only get a couple of minutes of use, but that's really all that's required usually, because you only need a couple of minutes to input your parameters, and then you can just leave it as is to observe the results. But I won't be using the one online. I'll be using essentially the same calculator, but the version I have that's still in its Excel form, so not the embedded version. Now, my version, my Excel version, does have a few more updates and things that have been changed. Nonetheless, it's mostly the same. So the changes that have happened is there's a few more consumption profiles in the version that I'm using, and we'll look to integrate a few more of these in the future. Okay, so how does it work? Well, you begin by entering your average consumption per workday and per weekend day. So let's do that in these two cells. So let's go with 30, say we're a big house using a lot of power, 30 kilowatt hours on a workday, and we're just staying at home maybe on the weekends too and using a lot of power too as well. Now, I'm using the real data sets from the Smart City Smart Grid program for Sydney. So this would be a Sydney household, and that's applicable as, again, we're trying to develop the hypothetical case of a household or business in the Osgrid area. All right, so the next step is to choose your pricing and electricity tariff structure. And this is what influences that schedule you see here with the colors, so off-peak, shoulder, peak, blah, blah, blah. When you change these, that changes automatically. Now, you'll also notice that it only shows what happens on a work day. It doesn't show what happens on a weekend day, but it is calculated in the back end. In other words, we could add another one of these graphs that show you the schedule for what happens on weekend days. That's been omitted from the calculator purely because of space. There's only so much space that we can fit on the embedded online calculator. If we add more to it, then it ceases to function properly because it only renders a portion of it at a time. So we couldn't add the graph for weekend days, but don't worry, those have their own schedule, and it's being drawn from your selection here as well. All right, so let's select Osgrid. We mentioned that's where our best candidates will be, but we can change if we want. I'm just going to zoom in case you're having trouble seeing. We can change that to Endeavour Energy, and you can see how the schedule here changes. Endeavour Energy and Osgrid are fairly identical in terms of when shoulder and peak are. Or we can change that to essential energy. Now, there's another bug. Well, it's not so much a bug. We're aware of it, but there's not an easy fix. In that essential energy's schedule, you'll notice says off-peak, peak, and off-peak again. And the colors do not match the previous the previous convention. Now, don't worry too much about that. They are being calculated appropriately. This portion, which is yellow, is being used as peak, and that portion is being used as off-peak. So it's just a case of the colors being wrong, but unfortunately that's not something that we can fix. The issue stems from the fact that there's 5 different types of, let's call them schedules on Endeavour and Osgrid's schedules, and there's only 3 for essential. So it tries to split up the colors, and that's why it might give you the impression that it's not calculating it correctly, but it is. So trust the labels, don't trust the colors, because on the essential distribution area, it seems a bit confusing, but it is calculating it correctly. All right, next thing is, let's go with Osgrid. To select your retailer, we've only added these 3, and again, the calculator only caters for New South Wales customers at the moment: Origin Energy, Energy Australia, or AGL. let's pick origin energy. And once you select that, you're given a tailored list of some of the tariff structures, franchise contracts that are on offer for Off-Grid and origin energy. So we can go for a time of use, which is what we have at the moment. But if we select, for instance, domestic, then obviously all your power use has one rate, so there is no schedule, it's all just peak, and you see that reflected in the top graph like that. So anyway, let's go with a time of use. This Power Smart seems all right. You can also select the discount. Now, most contracts, most franchise contracts, so the ones offered to most small electricity users, have a standing discount at this time. I think the minimum is something around 11%, but most common is 15% discount, and I've seen anything up to 25%. What's important is that at least for Origin Energy, Energy Australia, and AGL, and most retailers, that discount only applies to your consumption charges, not to your fixed charges and not to your service charges. So you can select that discount, and that will apply only to the consumption charges of that particular tariff structure. So you can change that if you want, maybe put 16 or 14. Oh, that's too much. I forgot to put the percentage. There we go, 14%. And if you want to keep the number, but you want the calculator to not use any discount, you can just select no here, and then it will just ignore that discount. Another way of doing that is just putting the discount at 0. But that's just for convenience sake. So let's go with yes, and actually let's turn that into 15%. Now, you can also select a solar PV system. Well, you can model one, and this will serve two purposes. If you are thinking of getting a battery in a solar PV system and a battery, then here's a place where you can input the details of the PV system that you're getting. Or if you're looking at it from a different angle, say you already have a PV system, then you can put the details for the PV system you already own in there. In which case, if you already own the PV system, it's just important to put the system size and the closest city, so we can model where the generation profile of that system, and you can ignore the cost if that's the case, if you've already paid for it. If you're going to get it in addition to the battery, so it's a new system, well then it's important to either add the cost here or select don't know. And then if you select don't know, it will use the last residential price per watt as given by Solar Choice. So those pricing trends that we saw, remember December was the lowest price ever for residential systems of $1.6 per watt. So if you say don't know, it's going to use that as the baseline to calculate the cost of that system. So in this case, if you put something like 10 kilowatts, that should cost 16,000, and we can see that by going behind the scenes. So this tab here under the hood at the bottom, that takes us behind the scenes, and we can see the price of the PV system is there, 16,000. Because I've said I don't know what the price is, it's just defaulted to the procurement cost of 1.6. All right. And I actually didn't go through it this time, but I'll go back to the pricing and electricity tariff. After you select all these details, those are looked up from a big table, and they're populated in this under the hood table. So this is where the calculations happen. So for the one we've selected, which was a maximizer domestic time of use for origin energy in the Off-Grid distribution area, that's 11 cents per kilowatt hour off peak, 20 cents per kilowatt hour shoulder, and 51 cents per kilowatt hour in peak, as we saw in the previous charts. And that with a discount equates to 10 cents, 17, and 43 cents respectively. PV exports, those are also looked up from a table in my Excel version, but unfortunately on the online version available now, those are set at a value of 6 cents, and those do not change with retailer. So if I go back to the summary and I change from Origin Energy to I don't know, Energy Australia, it will give me an error because it won't recognize this tariff structure for that retailer. So we have to reselect our tariff, and we'll say, well, it's a FlexiSaver, say we like that one, and we go back to this tab and we see that they only pay 5 cents per kilowatt hour of exported PV power. And that's, again, the standing offer as available in their electricity details PDFs. So that's where I've sourced those values. Again, this calculator does take that into account, the fact that the different retailers have somewhat different rewards offered for exported PV power, but the online version does not. The online version is set at 6 cents, regardless of whether that's what the retailer pays you. So just be aware of that. Unfortunately, that's not something that we can fix until the next version of the calculator, which hopefully will be around sometime from 2 weeks to a month from now. All right, so let's go back to Origin Energy. Let's go back to our domestic time of use Power Smart tariff structure. We're going to say we have a 10 kilowatt system because that would represent someone who's on the solar bonus scheme, let's say. Let's say we're in Sydney. That's used to model the generated power. Now, the way it calculates the power generated from the PV system is optimistic. So what I mean by that is, yes, there's some derating, but purely fixed derating. So it derates the entire output by 20%, and then it derates the output from that a bit more because of the inverter. So there's a derating of 20% plus about 8 or 5% extra from inverter losses. And then it assumes that the system is pitched at 30 degrees facing north and that it has no obstructions. There's also a few temperature factors taken into account, but those don't change the outcome by much. I don't think even 2%. So this models your PV generated power on an optimistic basis. So be aware of that. If your system isn't facing north or won't be able to face north, if you want to calculate derating losses over time, so more than the 20% that we account for, there's the fact that the panels will degrade, etc. If you want to take that into account, then you're going to have to do a bit more tailored analysis. A calculator at the moment won't do that for you, but that's something that we might explore in the future as well. All right, so those are our solar PV system details. 10 kilowatts in Sydney. We don't know the price. Actually, let's pretend that we do. And we're going to say it costs us, say, $12,800. And I'm picking that price because that, again, was based on the price per watt of the December price index for commercial system sizes from Solar Choice. So that's 1.28 cents per watt. And we're using that. All right, so our battery. I've pre-populated some batteries on offer by NaturalSolar, CSR Bradford, Energy Matters, AGL, and RedFlow. Now, these prices, I can't say much about them. Some of them are derived from rumors. I mean, the Tesla PowerWall on offer by all these providers is still fairly new, and it doesn't seem like everyone has locked down what the price is going to be, so there's still a bit of competition, a bit of hearsay, and a bit of... So these are the prices as we've obtained from some interviews, for instance, and media releases which have mentioned that of the expected price to be. So again, don't take especially the PowerWall prices too seriously. I think it's a good estimate, and I think some of these providers will be able to come to provide these systems at those prices, but we're not sure yet. For AGL, that's based off their website. They have a price for the systems and the battery systems on their own or as part of an installation, and so we've sourced that from there. And for RedFlow, again, that's through a supplier survey. We've asked RedFlow to give us an indication of what they think the price of the new ZBM2 is going to be once it's relaunched into the market this year, and that's the number that they gave us. So be aware that those numbers are flexible, and if you think they're not correct or you want to use your own, well, that's a good thing about the calculator. You can just go custom and fill out all those details there. All right, so what is calculated from the calculator? Well, it takes the useful battery size. So for instance, for this AGL Sunverge SIS 19.4 kilowatt hour battery, only 16.5 of it is useful. It uses the round trip efficiency. So when it charges the battery, it assumes perfect symmetry. So 5% of the energy will be lost going into the battery, and 5% of the energy will be lost coming out of the battery. We assume cycle life, not for degradation purposes, so that's another factor that is not taken into account in this calculator. We do not model the degradation of the battery over time, but it does give us an indication of how many cycles are left at the end of the requested period to analyze. We have obviously our max discharge rate and our max charging rate, and the cost, which I've explained previously. Now these two variables are very important. I mentioned price arbitration, and price arbitration doesn't always have to involve solar PV. It can involve a battery that simply draws power from the grid during off-peak times and then provides that power back when prices are more expensive from the grid. So if you want to use the battery for that particular scenario with or without PV, change this to yes. So what will happen is if the battery isn't fully charged and it's an off-peak time, it will draw power from the grid to charge the battery. I suggest going with no and sizing the PV system large enough so that it will provide most of the energy required to charge the battery and supply some loads for the residents. And then when should the battery be drained? This again, you can change that. So if you only want to drain it when it's the most expensive power, so that's only peak only, you can select that. If you want it to be used to meet loads during peak and shoulder, then you select that. And if you want the battery to meet loads whenever it has any charge available, then obviously you select that. So that lets you change when the battery discharges, whether it's just peak, peak and shoulder, or absolutely any time if there's charge. All right, so now we go to our new consumption. So let's go back to our original profile. Now you guys will not have this option on the online version, this top one, but basically this is original. So this is nothing. This is how the consumption will look if we do nothing, which is just a copy of the original plot. So it's just identical, but it's good to have it in the same spot so we can see how it changes as we change our project. All right, so what if we just add the new PV system? So we pretend we didn't have those 10 kilowatts already and we add them in. Well, that's what happens to the consumption from the grid. Realistically, it wouldn't go to zero like it does here because it would average out over the year and there's cloudy days and there's all sorts of things, but it's a good approximation that pretty much all power used during shoulder times and some of the power used during peak times on a work day, because this is only showing, well, this shows what happens on a work day and a weekend day. Work days are shown in blue and weekend days are shown in red, but the schedule, which is the backdrop, that is only applicable for work days. I haven't drawn in the weekend days, but they are being calculated in the background, they're just not shown. And that shows us what happens there. So with that, we knew that we would have to spend $12,800. We've selected a few parameters to make the financial analysis. We are assuming an annual electricity cost escalation of 3%, a discount rate of 5%, and we want to analyze this for, see, this is where I would change. If there's a battery involved in the project, batteries don't usually have a warranty that extends past 10 years. So if you're going to add a battery, I would put the number of years for analysis at 10. However, with a PV system, although we're not modeling the purchase of a new inverter, as that happens to be the first thing to fail, I would still increase the number of years to consider a purely solar PV project to maybe 15 or 20. So we say, okay, over 15 years, the net present value of this investment is about $9,000, an internal rate of return of 13.3%, which is obviously higher than a discount rate, so it gets a thumbs up, and a simple payback of 6.77 years, which looks pretty reasonable. So just with PV alone, we have a pretty good investment, and even if electricity costs don't escalate as much annually, say they only go up by 1%, it's still in the green because PV is a strong cost saver essentially. So even with annual electricity cost escalation of 1%, even with zero, it typically is a good investment. But let's set that back to 3, which might be reasonable given that we're staring at the death cycle, as I call it, in the face, and say, okay, well, that was just a new PV system. Now I want to add well, now let's look at the project of me buying a PV system and a battery in conjunction, as opposed to just PV. And that's what happens. Basically, it eliminates all power used during weekends, so that's why the red one is completely flat, and any power used during shoulder and peak on work days. Now, there's still a bit of power use left in the morning of some work days, and you can see that here, about 160 watts, which is almost nothing. And that is because of the limitations of this calculator. So this calculator repeats a weekly interval, so from Monday to Sunday, 52 times to calculate the results for a whole year. But it does so, and it assumes that the charge of the battery on the Monday, so the day it begins, is 0. So on the Monday, there's not any charge, there's no charge on the battery to supply these loads, so that's why we have to draw from the grid. But if this calculator were a year-long calculator that didn't repeat each weekly interval, then this could also potentially disappear. And so what does that look like? Well, all right. The cost of the battery by itself, a sun verge of that scale, that's about 20 grand. But we're also getting rid of a lot of shoulder and off-peak power, so it's probably a bit too big for our consumption. So let's change that. Instead of the sun verge 19.4 kilowatt hour, let's go with the sun verge 11.6 kilowatt hour battery, and that only has 9.9 kilowatt hours. And that's a bit more reasonable. So this is what happens now. As you hit shoulder, the PV output helps you meet those loads, and then when your solar resource disappear, the battery is also charged, so that will help you meet loads during peak times, as well as a bit of shoulder, and then finally the battery is fully depleted by the time it gets to off-peak, which is perfect, and so we've completely avoided all shoulder and peak during essentially the whole week, which is a good outcome. So how does that look? Well, actually, that doesn't look too bad. So we do have some, again, optimistic assumptions boiled into this. Remember that, especially in regards to PV and the fact that the battery is not assumed to degrade over time, and it will in real life. But we're looking at net present value over 15 years of 2,700. We still have some cycles left in the battery. The warranty will likely have expired, but hopefully the battery is still good. So we might even be able to bump the number of years to 16, or even more. Let's go to 20. I wouldn't recommend this in a real case, but so there we go. In 20 years, it'll finally use up all the cycles in the battery. That's, again, unrealistic. I doubt that would be the case, because the model hasn't considered the degradation in the battery's capacity, and over its cycle life, its capacity to store energy will probably drop by 40 to 60%. So this is, again, optimistic. So as I mentioned, if the battery is for 10, if the warranty for the battery is for 10 years, maybe leave that at 10. But if we just look at 10 years, then that still has a net present value of minus 6,000 and an internal rate of return of 0.1%, which is very low and definitely lower than our discount rate, which means it gets a thumb down. Nonetheless, let's go again with something. If this battery can keep that cycle life going, then maybe 14 or 15 year, and the battery's still there. We might just eke through with a simple payback of 10 years, an internal rate of return of 6.3, which is better than our discount rate, so it's a better investment technically, and it seems reasonable. Again, that's if we have a new PV system and a new battery. All right. Well, now let's pretend we're a solar bonus scheme customer, someone who was on the SBS and is now going to go off. So we already have a PV system, so we're not adding a new PV system. We're just going to add a new battery with existing PV, and this is what will really tell us what's really happening here. Okay, so basically we end up with the exact same profile, because that's exactly what's going to happen. But instead of paying for the PV system and the battery, so if we go back here, we saw that we had to pay 27,000, and our savings were 2,400 for that. We're just getting a new battery. So we still have to pay quite a hefty amount, about $15,000, but the savings we're deriving from it are substantially less. They're $701. And so that's what tells us, really, if you have a PV system and you're thinking of just adding a new battery, it doesn't look too good. Because the reason we thought it was a good idea, and it wasn't easy to tell before, is because the PV system on its own generates such amount of savings that it gives the impression that adding a battery and a PV system is a good investment. But if you take the battery out and just do the PV investment, you'll realize that that's where you're deriving most of your savings from. It's not from the battery. While the battery does give you some savings, as I mentioned, about $701 on the first year, and that increments with price escalation, it's paltry in comparison to the capital costs that they require, at least today, but that might change in the future. So that will help you calculate that if you're on the SBS and thinking about it. Let's use some more hopeful assumptions. So let's say our annual electricity cost escalation is 5%. So if the death spiral really takes hold, and we'll push the number of years, and we'll assume the battery will last us maybe 16, and then we start to get to a simple payback of maybe 14.94 years, but our internal rate of return is still lower than our discount rate, which means it's not a good investment in comparison. What we could do is say, well, let's get a different type of battery. Maybe if we get RedFlow, which I know has a smaller price per effective kilowatt hour, we're almost eking out a positive net present value over 16 years, but we've used a lot more cycles of the battery, so that wouldn't work either. So it's hard to find the cases where this might work on paper like this, but there could be a few. So for instance, let's try changing our discount to 14%. Let's change our PV system to something smaller. No. Let's change that to maybe 13 years. No, but let's keep our PV system at 10 kilowatts. Again, still not quite there. Comes close, but no cigar. And that's what we've seen with most of the cases. The net present value for them is negative. Now, I'm not the only person that's saying this, and I'll explore this in a bit more detail once we go back to some of our slides. All right, so now a bit more about how this works. In the background, we're calculating each point here in 15-minute intervals across two tables. So the way we do this is we have these two big tables. So this one is for work days, beginning on a Monday. There's a whole bunch of time stuff here that you shouldn't concern yourself with. But we have our load, then we adjust that load to meet the kilowatt hours per day, which you inputted in the top parameters. So we adjust our kilowatt hours, and then we derive our load by multiplying it by 4, given that these are intervals of 50 minutes. On the Monday, we assume the starting battery charge is 0, and we calculate how much we can drain from the battery, and that's a combination, obviously, of the discharge rate, of the starting charge state of the battery, and whether that can be drained as a load anyway. We have also our max charging permissible, so how much we can put into the battery, and that depends again on the charging rate as opposed to the discharging rate, and the state of the battery. And then we calculate whether it's negative or positive, which gives us whether the battery will be charging or discharging, and whether we're using excess PV or whether that's being accomplished with the grid. And this column U, again, will only populate if it's using the price arbitration toggle, which I showed you before. Then we have our average PV output, which is scaled to represent the system size that you guys inputted, and we calculate our excess PV by removing the load from the amount of PV available, and if there's any, we'll figure out what to do with that in the model. This all changes based on whether it's off-peak or shoulder. So for instance, if we look here, I'm not sure if you can see this, but here in column U, the battery says it could charge with 750 kilowatt hours, but it didn't, and it won't. Why? Because we've told it not to use price arbitration. But if we change that over here and say yes, use off-peak power, and we go back to there, then we see, oh, okay, well, the battery charges by almost a kilowatt hour for all these time entries until it's pretty much fully charged by, what time is this? 4:15 a.m. And you can see that in the resulting dashboard. So that's that big jump here at the start of the day. It's because it's filling up the battery. That tends to be not a good idea if you have enough solar resource to charge the battery, because then once you get to the time when the sunshine, the battery is already full, so the system has nothing to do except export that power, which isn't what we want. So usually you set this at no. What else is calculated? We calculate what the load is after battery charging and after PV taken into account, and then we basically plot all these values. So this is one of the tables, and this represents 15-minute intervals for, sorry, we're looking at weekends here. If we go here, we're looking at weekdays, so work days. 15-minute intervals, and it goes through the whole week that way. And then it uses the charge that's left available in the battery. In this case, it's 0 as the starting for the Saturday on the next day. And then we calculate the averages of all these work days and all these weekend days and place them into a table that has the average for the workday and a table that has the average for the weekend day, and then that's what we plot here. So that's it in a nutshell. Like I said, since it does a week interval that's repeated a lot of times, there's some inaccuracy, so you should take a bit of care not to rely too much on these for big investments, and make sure you get a good study done before diving to any big money sums. As well as this tool, we have a tool that does do a yearly analysis, so it still repeats the weekly load every time. So it takes a weekly load and it multiplies it for however many weeks we need, but it uses the solar PV output as provided by some modeling data, and so that's the actual output that we might expect from the PV system over a whole year. So it doesn't repeat the PV output for each week. It actually looks at what time and date it is, and it estimates what will be the generated PV output. And it also, instead of resetting the charge to 0 every Monday, it just carries on the analysis for the whole year. And so that gives us a much accurate, well, a more accurate profile of consumption, but unfortunately it requires a lot of computing power, because it's about, I don't know, something in 90,000 lines of code, and it's a lot of computing power, and by that I mean that it takes probably maybe 12 seconds to calculate, which isn't much, but it wouldn't have a good user interface if we were to plot that online, which is why the version that's available online only does a loop of a single week, and it doesn't do a loop of a whole year, because it would be too slow to have a good user experience. All right. Now, as I mentioned, this is a recording because the original webinar was not recorded appropriately. So there were a few questions that were asked at this point, and this might sound funny, but I hope that I've addressed them already. Some of them were asking how often is this calculator going to be updated, the online version, obviously. And as I mentioned, we're hoping to have one more version out in 2 weeks to a month, but there's no promises to that. And we're looking to add a few more features to make it a bit more accurate while retaining the snappiness of the weekly repeating, the repeating weekly version as opposed to the whole year. Okay, so let's go back to our slides. So I showed that it's a bit tricky to get a good net present value from systems, even where we think they might have the best case in the Osgrid distribution area. And I'm not alone in this. There's been other groups that have looked at this and looked at whether it might be profitable, and if not, when. Well, we have to remember a few things. Well, one, obviously, is that the automotive industry, so that's Tesla Motors and recently the Chevy Bolt, so that's GM, and the Nissan Leaf. So these new vehicles and companies, they're spearheading the development of batteries and bringing down the price of them. So that's going to spill over to the stationary battery market and hopefully give us better batteries and cheaper batteries pretty soon. So this is a meta-analysis by the University of Melbourne. They looked at the predictions of lithium-ion battery storage costs from a variety of sources, and not just from one source at a time. They looked at the same source over time and how their predictions changed over several years. And as you can see here, Deutsche Bank have already had to change their predictions because the price drops are happening faster than they expected them. So the original price is this line here that they saw, this starting at 600, whereas now they've drawn this line that's lower. So even people who predicted the prices years ago are now expecting this to accelerate even more. And Bloomberg Finance, for instance, they've also had to do readjustments to their predictions, and mostly to say that they're becoming cheaper faster. So there's also a report by the ATA that looked and analyzed these systems much like we might be doing with our calculator, but in a different way, and for other capital cities and other markets, to see when the net present value of a PV system with a battery would be higher than for a simple PV system. And at the moment, they found that that was not the case for big batteries or small batteries in any capital city in Australia, and you can see that in the chart on the left. However, they expected that by 2020, certain cities would experience a net present value for a PV system and a battery that would be better than just the PV system by itself. And that obviously is seen here: Adelaide, Alice Springs, Cairns maybe just slightly, Darwin, and potentially Perth. Sydney is still lagging behind, but again, we're not so sure where battery prices and electricity prices are going. And a key point to this study, for instance, is that I believe that ATA used a 1% price escalation rate per year for their electricity prices, which I do believe is on top of inflation, but nonetheless that is potentially a conservative amount. So if we see higher price increases faster than that, then these trends could be pushed further ahead and we might see competitive scenarios for them sooner. And more than that, well, I'll get to that in a bit. I sort of preempted myself there. Well, all right, so that's price arbitration, but let's not forget that we also talked about peak shaving. And so what about these new developments as well? So both RedFlow and Tesla Energy, as well as others, have developed and launched other batteries that will serve for larger clients, not just residential and small businesses. What we see down there is, for instance, the Power Pack, which was showcased at the launch of the Tesla Energy PowerWall and Power Pack together. So what is key to these big systems and key for these big systems and these businesses or customers who use a lot of power is that once you use more than around, I believe the threshold is 100 megawatt hours per year in New South Wales, then you're forced over to a contested contract. And contested contracts also have demand charges, which means you are charged not just for the consumption of power in terms of kilowatt hours, but also for your peak draw of power. So not just the energy, but the power. And we see here this bill, for instance, they are charged $15 per kVA or kilowatt amp that they draw during that month. So during that month, the highest draw over a 30-minute interval will be multiplied by $15 for that particular schedule. So in this case, just peak, and that will give them their charge for that month. So it's a charge that happens every month, and typically with large customers, demand charges and fixed charges can take up more than 50% of the bill. So this is where most of the money, and especially for this client as well, most of the money goes. So what can batteries do to reduce that? Well, this is what we have called peak shaving. So it's not so much as load shifting, but that can be a part of it too, as it is to reducing the amount of power drawn from the grid. Let's look at that. So we have a case study here, which is a feedlot near Orange. Now this is the consumption profile of the feedlot. We visited this farm in mid-2014, I believe, and it's interesting to see from the interval data that we acquired how consistent the load is through the entire year. So the operations at the feedlot basically involve turning on a mill at anywhere between 3 to 6 a.m. in the morning to prepare the feed for the cows. And that runs for about 5 hours using about 70 to 80 kilowatts or up to 90 kilowatts of power, and then it's turned off obviously once the feed is ready. And this is a feedlot, an intensive animal farm that operates every single day of the year through Christmas, through every single holiday. So you see this consistent profile of energy consumption every single day, weekends, holidays, Christmas, every day. And because of that, it is, I believe, one of the best showcases of where energy storage could have a good role. So let's say, well, we want to add solar PV, which might be one option to manage the energy use of this, the energy cost of this client. Unfortunately, though, if you want to size this correctly, you'd end up with a paltry 40 kilowatt system, and that's the energy that would be generated from that system, as you can see in that yellow hill there. That's the energy that would be removed from the grid. And yep, it's something, but it really doesn't meet the clients or the feedlot's main issue, which is, again, they're getting hit by really high demand charges. So potentially what you could do is, well, move operations 4 hours forward. So you shift all your loads 4 hours later, and then you could also have a big PV system, and that would help meet a lot of the demand. And then if you combine that with some power factor correction and maybe some other scheduling, that could also bring down the demand charges. But it's risky and maybe unlikely, because it only takes one cloudy day, and if you turn that mill on and use all that power, then it doesn't matter how much PV you have, you'll still be hit with a large kVA charge. So PV would help them with their consumption charges significantly if they could load shift by 4 hours into the day. Unfortunately, and I'm not sure how much you guys know about feedlots, but I learned that it's impossible for them to do this, because not only does the feed have to be ready for the cows, as cows have preferences as stipulated by both their nutritionists and vets, but the feedlot itself also has to have the capacity to operate after the feeding time. So they have to make sure that the operation of the mill is taken care of in the early time of the day, so that there's a few hours left afterwards if anything goes wrong. So no way can they load shift that way. So what's next to do? Well, that's when we commissioned and talked to a provider to have a look at some of what could happen with a battery system that would sort of achieve this load shifting in a pseudo way. So what we have here is the red line depicts, again, the average profile over the whole year, And the blue line depicts what would happen if they installed a 70 kilowatt PV system, and you can see the generated power again shown in that yellow hill, as well as a 360 kilowatt hour battery storage system. Now, when this was commissioned, the battery was still stipulated to be lead acid, which means it was only about 180 kilowatt hours of effective useful kilowatt hours. And what you'll see is the system is built so that it tries to avoid peak time. So that's the area denoted by that pink shading at the back. And you'll also see, and that's that new blue line, that shows you the new consumption once you have this PV and battery system. And you'll also see that there's a bit more consumption past 10 p.m. going all the way to 3 a.m. on the next day. And you might be wondering, well, what is that? Well, the way it works is the battery sources energy to meet loads during peak time from both the solar system as well as from off-peak power. So when the battery is depleted, because it's been providing energy to meet the loads during peak time, once it hits 10 p.m., then it's off-peak, then it's issued to recharge using off-grid power. It takes a while for the battery to recharge, and then by 3 a.m. it's ready to help serve the next load when the mill is turned on. And this can generate substantial savings for the feedlot. So when we calculated this, this had a price tag of somewhere around $400,000, so 400K, but savings in the 36 to 45K. So still a pretty long payback rate of 9 to 11 years, and because of that, the feedlots' bank wouldn't look at it with a lot of interest. However, we have to reiterate this was done with lead acid as the technology to deliver. Now that we have technology such as the power pack, it's a case of reevaluating those price points and the flexibility that lithium-ion may offer us and see where we stand. So this is, again, where larger systems and larger customers might look for in terms of using batteries. And one of the last things is, well, remember, I might have shown that battery systems plus PV are still a bit expensive, but this is a chart I put together using two sources of data. So the blue line is from the Australian Photovoltaic Institute, and they obtained their data from the Clean Energy Regulator and the RECS registry. So up until September 2014, the RECS, as part of registering a renewable energy certificate, you would have to provide the out-of-pocket costs of the installation of that system. So how much did the owner have to pay to get that system installed? And that let us draw this blue line of system prices all the way from February 2010 till May 2014 when it was discontinued. So what I've done in order to continue that line is I've used the pricing information published by Solar Choice, which again isn't a true reflection of the prices that people are paying because it's quotes, it's not actual systems going in, but it's a true enough estimation. And what you can see there is I've used that green and red. The difference between those is that the green represents the price without the rebate, so the real price without subsidies, we could call it, while the red line is an estimate of what the price to the customer will actually be, given that it's likely that they'll get a rebate by providing the renewable energy certificates to the installer. So if we look back in February 2010, there was still about 10,000 systems being installed at a price of $8 per watt. And it's telling that it doesn't matter so much price-wise, while it definitely holds importance. Even when these systems were incredibly expensive, as might be the case for batteries now, there was a lot of systems going in. Mind you, the average PV system price back in 2010 was about 1.5 kilowatts, and they were receiving a multiplier on the RECS that they received of 3 back then. So the average system price for that would have been somewhere around $12,000, and with the rebate, they might have gotten $2,000 to $3,000 worth of RECS rebates. So they would have been out of pocket by $9,000, yet there was still 10,000 installations back then. So that's telling to us, look, we think there's going to be a big market for batteries, because we know they're expensive, but that definitely didn't stop solar PV. And more so now that it's become a bit of a no-brainer because the savings are so substantial, we might see a similar trend happen with batteries. Whereas they might be a bit expensive today, as they come down in price, we'll see even more and more market growth. Well, that really concludes the meat, let's say, of this presentation. There's a few other things that I'll mention again because they're important for farmers and businesses and households in terms of getting systems. Again, take everything I say with a grain of salt. I might have made an assumption that is incorrect, and it's imperative that you seek advice from a good supplier or someone that's willing to provide independent advice. When getting a PV system, remember, or any type of systems, remember to do your due diligence. Check panel warranties. The industry standard is 80% nominal power up to 20 years. Check your inverter warranties. Check your installation warranties. Few installers don't have a workmanship warranty, and that's pretty bad. Make sure the Clean Energy Council accredited. I doubt you'll be able to encounter anyone who isn't. Maybe get Tier 1 products. That's not a specific requirement. But what's most important is that you get a system and components that have a presence in Australia, that are reputable and are cost effective. So make sure you get a few quotes, compare systems, and compare the reputation of both the components and the installer. There's a few sites where you might find some information and services to help you with this. Obviously, as I mentioned before, there's solarchoice.net.au. They'll help you get a bunch of quotes, as well as solarquotes.com.au, and I think there's another one called australiansolarquotes.com.au. If you want to know more about financing options and what's available, check out the OEH financing guide in that link below. Remember that both renewable energy certificates, so both the small technology certificates and large generation certificates, are currently experiencing some very large, or are currently under very big price increases. They're at a good price, as well as energy saving certificates, so ESCs. So those are the ones you might be able to obtain if you do an installation of energy efficiency equipment, specifically lighting. So if you have a business and you're still running a lot of halogen lights or incandescent lights, make sure you talk to someone or accredited certificate provider to see if you can get some ESCs and install some brand new lights for a reduced cost. Other than that, there's also, of course, some of the materials that we've developed in collaboration with the Office of Environment and Heritage. We've generated materials on solar pumping, as well as a technical document on how to size and select and design PV systems for pumping applications, both for stock and domestic and irrigation purposes, which was put together with the help of GSES. We have some brochures on those two particular use cases, so pumping for stock and domestic and for irrigation solutions, and a general guide for renewable energy in agriculture, and you can go to those links to download a copy of those. And finally, obviously, there's the Ag Innovators portal, where you can find more of this information. Subscribe and you'll get updates when other webinars such as this one are available, and other programs which New South Wales Farmers might be promoting as well. And finally, there's the Independent Farm Energy Advice Service currently offered by New South Wales Farmers. It's a service that I provide. The prices you see in front of you are for members. Non-members of New South Wales Farmers will have to pay an extra margin of 25%. But as I mentioned, for instance, if you want me to run an analysis using the yearly long Excel calculator as opposed to one available online, which uses a repeating model, we can do that via our introductory consulting package, which is priced there. And I'm more than happy to take a query on anything relating to solar PV, especially in agriculture. So get in touch with us if that's of your interest. All right, well, I won't fool anyone. This has been a recording for those who were unable to attend the previous webinar. So there is actually no one listening to me at the moment, so there won't be any questions. But I hope if you do have a question, you get in touch with me via email. That would be to energyinformation@newsouthalesfarmers.org.au, or call New South Wales Farmers, or specifically my landline on 0294781004. And with that, thank you very much, and I hope you have a good day.